The embassy kitchen glowed like a furnace at the edge of known space, where chrome towers spiraled into alien skies and diplomats from 17 worlds gathered to decide humanity's worth. Christopher Wade stood at his station, wooden spoon steady in his calloused hands, stirring a pot of macaroni and cheese, while ambassadors laughed in 7 languages beyond the doors. But when the small alien girl with eyes like violet nebulae tasted his food and called it yellow glue, the entire hall fell silent. Because what happened next would prove that some recipes carry more than flavor, they carry the memory of love itself, and that changes everything. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The galactic embassy kitchen stretched like a cathedral of steel and flame, where copper pots hung from rails that disappeared into shadow and burners hissed with gases from 12 different atmospheres. Christopher Wade moved through the heat, with the economy of someone who had learned long ago that wasted motion was wasted time. His chef's whites were stained with turmeric and tomato, his hands scarred from years of knife work and burns that had become a second skin. He stirred a pot of macaroni and cheese, the wooden spoon tracing slow circles through golden cream. Beyond the service doors, the grand dining hall thrummed with the voices of power. Thessian diplomats with skin like polished amethyst debated trade routes in harmonic tones. Crathery magistrates clicked their mandibles over contract disputes. Gryzian security officers stood like carved obsidian at every pillar, their scaled faces betraying nothing. And at the center of it all, Ambassador Valera held court. Her daughter Nera perched on a cushion beside her throne, violet eyes, watching everything with the sharp curiosity of children who have learned too early that the world does not soften for them. Christopher ladled the mac and cheese into a ceramic bowl, the pasta gleaming with butter and cream, topped with a sprinkle of breadcrumbs he had toasted that morning. It was a simple dish, the kind he used to make for Emma on cold nights when the world felt too big and too cruel. He set it on the serving tray, nodded to Pip, the small Valari assistant whose 6 fingers could plate faster than any human, and watched as the dish disappeared through the doors. The kitchen fell into its rhythm, sauces reduced, proteins seared, vegetables roasted in cast iron until their edges caramelized into something close to magic. Christopher worked in silence, listening to the distant hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter that reminded him he was always cooking for people who would never see his face. Then, the doors burst open. Pip stumbled through, tray empty, his furry face pale beneath the bioluminescent markings that usually glowed with joy. The entire kitchen turned. Christopher set down his knife, his chest tightening with the instinct that comes before disaster. "Chef," Pip whispered, his voice trembling. "The girl. Ambassador Valera's daughter," she said. He swallowed hard. "She called it yellow glue." The kitchen went silent. Even the burners seemed to hiss lower, as if the flames themselves had recoiled. Christopher's hands steadied on the edge of the counter, his knuckles white against the steel. Beyond the doors, laughter erupted, sharp and cruel, echoing through the hall like breaking glass. The laughter did not fade. It built like a storm, rolling through the grand dining hall in waves that crashed against the kitchen doors. Christopher stood motionless, his breath steady despite the heat crawling up his neck. Pip wrung his 6-fingered hands, bioluminescent patches flickering with distress. The other kitchen staff had frozen mid-task, their eyes fixed on Christopher, as if waiting for permission to feel the humiliation on his behalf. He did not give it. He simply wiped his hands on his apron, untied it with slow deliberation, and folded it over the back of a chair. Then he walked toward the service doors. "Chef, don't," Pip whispered, but Christopher was already pushing through into the light. The grand dining hall opened before him like the mouth of a beast. Chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, their light refracted through crystals that had been mined from dead stars. Tables stretched in concentric circles, each one occupied by delegates whose species Christopher had learned to recognize by scent, by the sound of their breathing, by the way they held their silverware. At the center, elevated on a dais of polished onyx, sat Ambassador Valera, She was tall, even by Thessian standards, her skin a deep violet that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her robes shimmered with thread spun from alloys Christopher could not name, and beside her, small and painfully out of place, sat Nera. The girl's violet eyes were wide, her bioluminescent markings dim with confusion. In front of her sat the bowl of macaroni and cheese, untouched except for a single spoonful. Christopher walked forward. The laughter died in sections, like candles snuffed by an unfelt wind. Delegates turned, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disdain. Culinary Magistrate Zex, a Krathari whose mandibles glittered with ceremonial silver, leaned forward in his seat, forearms folded across his chitinous chest. Ambassador Valera's gaze fell upon Christopher like a blade. "Ah," she said, her voice carrying the music of her species but none of its warmth. "The human cook. Have you come to explain your yellow glue?" Nera flinched. Her markings flickered once, briefly bright, then dimmed again. Christopher stopped at the edge of the dais. He did not bow. He did not apologize. He met Valera's gaze with the quiet steadiness of a man who had buried a daughter and learned that some things could not break him. "It's called macaroni and cheese," he said simply. "It's a dish my people have made for generations." Valera's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles could cut. "Then your people have settled for mediocrity for generations." She gestured to the bowl. "My daughter speaks truth. This is paste. Primitive. Void of complexity." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. A Grisian officer chuckled, a sound like stones grinding. Magistrate Zex clicked his mandibles in amusement. Christopher's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Valera raised one elegant hand. "I will offer you a chance, human," she said, her voice pitched to carry. "Prove that Earth's cuisine deserves a place in this embassy. Create something worthy of my daughter's palate. You have 10 days. She paused, her smile sharpening. "And if you fail, Earth's culinary traditions will be banned from this embassy. Forever." The hall went silent. Christopher held her gaze, then nodded once. He turned and walked back through the doors, leaving the laughter behind. The kitchen closed at midnight, but Christopher remained. He sat on a stool near the cooling ovens, the heat still radiating from the steel like the memory of fire. The overhead lights had been dimmed to a soft amber glow, and the silence pressed against him with the weight of all the words he had not said in the grand dining hall. His hands rested on his knees, still smelling faintly of butter and garlic despite 3 washings. 10 days. The challenge echoed in his mind like a sentence handed down by judges who had already decided the verdict. He had cooked in Michelin-starred restaurants, had trained under chefs whose names were whispered with reverence. But none of that mattered here, in a kitchen at the edge of known space, where his humanity was the punchline to a joke he had not asked to be part of. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling. Emma, 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, blonde hair pulled into pigtails that never stayed neat for more than an hour. She sat at their kitchen table back on Earth, a bowl of macaroni and cheese in front of her, her spoon raised in triumph. He had taken the picture 3 years ago, 2 months before the accident that had rewritten his life into before and after. She had loved macaroni and cheese. Not the boxed kind, though she never complained when that was all they could afford. She loved the version he made on special days, when he had time to grate real cheddar and simmer milk into cream. She would stand on a stool beside him, asking questions about why the cheese melted, why the pasta had to be cooked just right, why some things tasted better when you made them slowly. Because, he had told her once, stirring the pot while she watched with those wide, believing eyes, cooking isn't just about feeding people. It's about showing them you care. She had nodded, solemn as a philosopher. So, every bite is like a hug. Exactly like a hug. Christopher closed his eyes, the photograph pressed between his thumb and palm. The memory of her laugh, bright and unguarded, filled the quiet kitchen. He had not made macaroni and cheese for anyone after she died. The dish had become a grave he could not visit without collapsing. But tonight, serving it to strangers who had mocked it, he realized something he had been too grief-stricken to see. Nira had called it yellow glue. Not with cruelty, with honesty. The girl had tasted something her world had never taught her to recognize. She had no context for comfort, no framework for love translated into food. Her confusion was not an insult, it was an absence. And absence, Christopher knew, could be filled. He stood slowly, walked to the pantry, and stared at shelves lined with ingredients from a dozen worlds. Somewhere in this kitchen was the answer. Not to prove himself, not to win a challenge born from cruelty, but to teach a small girl what caring tasted like, the way he had once taught Emma. Christopher returned to his station, pulled out a notebook, and began to write. The archive room sat 3 levels below the kitchen, a place where few bothered to descend. Christopher stood before rows of digital terminals that hummed with the collected knowledge of 17 species, his fingers hovering over the interface. Pip had shown him how to access the historical databases, the ones that catalogued not just treaties and wars but the small, forgotten details of daily life across the galaxy. He searched for cheese. Not the synthesized protein blocks that most stations used, but real cheese. Cultures grown in time, aged in patience, touched by hands that understood fermentation as conversation between human and microbe. The first entry appeared like a whisper from the past. Gruyere from the colony on Proxima 7, a settlement that had vanished during the expansion wars. The records showed wheels aged in caves carved from asteroid rock, the low gravity creating a texture that melted like silk. Christopher noted the coordinates of the last known shipment. The second cheese revealed itself in a mining station manifest. Aged white cheddar from the Titan agricultural domes, sharp and crumbly, made by families who had refused to abandon Earth's methods even when efficiency demanded it. The dome had been decommissioned 15 years ago, but a small collective still operated in its shadow, selling to traders who valued tradition over speed. Conte appeared in the records of a monastery ship, monks who had carried their copper vats and cultures across the stars, believing that some rituals could not be abandoned even in exile. They orbited a red dwarf, their cheese aging in chambers where time moved differently, where patience was not a choice, but a vow. Fontina came from an Italian enclave on Europa Station, immigrants who had smuggled their starter cultures in their luggage, who had learned to make cheese, in artificial gravity, by trial and error and stubbornness. The records showed small wheels wrapped in cloth, sold at markets where homesickness could be purchased by the gram. Christopher scrolled through botanical surveys, terraforming reports, agricultural experiments that had failed or been forgotten. Then he found it. Parmigiano Reggiano, real and impossible, aged for 36 months in a facility on Ganymede that had been designed for entirely different purposes. A single cheesemaker, a woman named Rosa Delgado, had converted a decommissioned oxygen processing plant into an aging room. She sold to almost no one. Her cheese was too expensive, too slow, too stubbornly real for a galaxy that preferred convenience. Christopher wrote down her name. Each cheese would require negotiation, shipping, cost that the embassy kitchen budget could not cover. He would need to use his own savings, the small account he had kept untouched since Emma died. Money, he had told himself, was for emergencies. This was an emergency, not of survival, but of meaning. He closed the terminal and stood in the dim archive, surrounded by the weight of forgotten history. Somewhere above him, Nira slept in quarters too large and too cold. Somewhere above her, stars burned in patterns that had no names in any language spoken here. Christopher climbed the stairs back to the kitchen and began making calls. The kitchen woke at 4 in the morning, but Christopher had been there since 3. The cheeses had arrived over the course of 6 days, each one a small miracle wrapped in temperature-controlled containers. The Gruyere from Proxima 7 gleamed pale gold under the prep lights. The aged white cheddar from Titan crumbled like ancient stone. The Conte from the monastery ship carried the scent of caves and time. The fontina from Europa station wept with moisture, ready to melt into silk. And the Parmigiano Reggiano, aged 36 months on Ganymede, sat like a crown jewel, its crystals catching light like trapped stars. He grated each cheese separately, his movements methodical, meditative. The sound of steel against aged rind filled the quiet kitchen like a psalm. Pip arrived at 5, yawning, his bioluminescent markings still dim with sleep. He stopped when he saw the mound of cheese, his 6-fingered hands rising to his mouth. "Chef," Pip whispered. "This must have cost—" "Don't worry about the cost," Christopher said quietly. He set down the grater and reached for the butter, real butter churned from cream that had never seen a synthesizer. He worked through the morning, building the bechamel base with the patience his grandmother had taught him. Butter melted into flour, the roux darkening to the color of sand. Milk, warmed to blood temperature, whispered into the pan in a steady stream. He stirred without stopping, his wrist locked in the rhythm that turned separate ingredients into something unified. The sauce thickened, turned glossy, began to smell like comfort made tangible. At 7 in the morning, when the kitchen staff began filtering in for breakfast prep, Christopher heard it. A small sound, barely louder than breathing. He turned and saw her. Nira stood in the doorway, her violet eyes wide, her bioluminescent markings pulsing faintly with curiosity. She wore a sleeping gown that pooled around her small feet, and her hair, dark as space itself, hung loose around her shoulders. She should not have been here. The kitchen was off limits to delegates and their families. But she had come anyway, drawn by something she could not name. Christopher did not send her away. He simply nodded once, an invitation without words, and returned to his work. Nira crept closer, her feet silent on the concrete floor. She stopped at the edge of his station, her eyes fixed on the pot where the bechamel turned in slow, hypnotic circles. "What are you making?" she asked, her voice small and careful, as if she expected to be scolded for speaking. "Something that takes time," Christopher said. He reached for the first cheese, the Gruyere, and began adding it in small handfuls. The sauce accepted each addition like a gift, the cheese melting into golden threads. Nira watched in silence. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she asked, "Why does it smell like that?" "Like what?" She struggled for words, her markings flickering. Like someone who cares." Christopher's hand stilled for just a moment. Then he continued stirring, his voice steady. "Because that's what it is." He glanced at her, this small alien girl who had called his food yellow glue, and saw not cruelty but hunger. Not for food. For something deeper. "Would you like to help?" he asked. Nira's eyes went wide. Then, slowly, she nodded. Nira's hands were smaller than Emma's had been, her fingers longer and more delicate. But they held the wooden spoon with the same careful reverence. Christopher stood behind her, his hands hovering near hers, not touching but guiding through presence alone. The bechamel turned in slow circles, the 5 cheeses now fully incorporated, the sauce glowing like molten amber under the kitchen lights. "You have to keep stirring," Christopher said softly. "If you stop, it separates. The fat and the liquid. Remember, they're supposed to be different things." Nira's brow furrowed in concentration. "But they look the same now. How do they remember?" "Because nothing really forgets what it is," Christopher said. "You just have to convince it that being together is better." She stirred in silence, her markings pulsing in rhythm with her movements. The sauce thickened further, taking on a consistency that seemed to defy the laws of emulsion. It did not break. It did not separate. It held together with a molecular stubbornness that made Christopher think of his grandmother's hands, steady and sure, teaching him that some things could not be rushed. The kitchen had begun to fill with mourning staff, but they kept their distance, watching this strange tableau, a human chef and an alien child, working in silence over a pot that smelled like every warm memory Christopher had ever carried. At 8 in the morning, culinary magistrate Zex arrived for his daily inspection. He moved through the kitchen on four legs, his mandibles clicking as he examined prep stations, tasted sauces, made notes on a digital tablet that glowed against his chitinous chest. When he reached Christopher's station, he stopped, his compound eyes fixed on the pot, then on Nira, then back to the pot. He leaned forward, his antennae twitching. "What is this?" Zex asked, his voice a symphony of clicks and harmonics that the translator rendered as skeptical curiosity. "Bechamel," Christopher said simply. 5 cheese. Zex's mandibles spread slightly, the Krathari equivalent of a frown. The molecular structure appears unstable. It should have separated at this temperature. He pulled a small scanner from his belt and passed it over the pot. The device chirped, then fell silent. Zex stared at the readings, his antennae flattening against his head. "This is not possible," he said slowly. "The fat content, the protein chains, the heat index, they are in complete opposition. This should be broken sauce." Christopher allowed himself a small smile. "It's not about the science. It's about the timing." "Timing is science," Zex countered. "Timing is patience," Christopher corrected. "Patience is something else." Zex clicked his mandibles in what might have been irritation or respect. He made a notation on his tablet, then looked at Nira, who had not stopped stirring. "The ambassador's daughter should not be in the kitchen." "The ambassador's daughter," Nira said quietly, her voice steadier than before, "is learning." Zex studied her for a long moment, then he turned and walked away without another word. Christopher glanced down at Nira. Her markings had brightened to a soft lavender glow, pride mixed with something that looked like belonging. "You're doing perfectly," he told her. She smiled for the first time since he had met her. It was small, uncertain, but real, and the bechamel, impossible and whole, continued to turn. The pasta had been cooked to precisely 8 minutes, pulled from boiling water at the moment when resistance gave way to tenderness without crossing into softness. Christopher drained it in a colander that steamed like a geyser, then tossed it with butter so each piece glistened. He folded the pasta into the bechamel in 3 careful additions, the sauce coating every curve and hollow, the 5 cheeses clinging like gold leaf to ancient statues. He transferred a small portion into a ceramic bowl, the same style he had used 3 nights ago when everything had begun. But this was different. This had been built with intention, with memory, with the patient accumulation of minutes that could not be bought or synthesized or rushed. Nira stood beside him, her violet eyes fixed on the bowl. It was 2 in the morning. She had returned to the kitchen every night for the past 6 nights, slipping past security protocols her mother did not know were being ignored. Torvand, the Gryzian head of security, had seen her on the monitors. He had said nothing. Some laws, his silence suggested, were worth breaking. Christopher set the bowl on the counter between them. Steam rose in delicate spirals, carrying with it the scent of caves and thyme and cream turned into silk. "This is for you," he said quietly. "Not for the challenge. Not for your mother. For you." Nira's markings flickered with uncertainty. "What if I still don't understand it?" "Then I'll try again," Christopher said. "As many times as it takes." She reached for the spoon with both hands, her fingers trembling slightly. She lifted a small portion, blew on it with the careful attention of a child who had been burned before, and brought it to her lips. The kitchen went silent. Even the ventilation system seemed to hold its breath. Nira tasted. Her eyes widened. Her markings flared brilliant violet, then gold, then a color Christopher had never seen on Thessian skin, a soft, warm pink that spread across her cheeks like dawn breaking over frozen ground. She lowered the spoon slowly, her mouth still full, her expression caught between shock and something that looked like grief for all the years she had lived without knowing this was possible. She swallowed. A single tear tracked down her cheek, glowing faintly with bioluminescence. "This is..." She stopped, her voice breaking. She tried again. "This is what caring tastes like." Christopher's throat tightened. He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. Nira took another bite, then another, each one slower than the last, as if she were trying to memorize the feeling. When the bowl was half empty, She set down the spoon and looked up at him with eyes that had learned something fundamental about the universe. "My mother has never made me anything," she whispered. "She says efficiency is more important than ritual. That time spent cooking is time wasted." Christopher knelt so they were eye level. "Time spent caring is never wasted." Neera's markings pulsed once, bright as a star. "Will you teach me? Not just this. Everything. All the ways food can mean love." Christopher felt something in his chest unlock, a door he had kept bolted since Emma died. "Yes," he said. "I'll teach you." The grand dining hall had been prepared for judgment. Delegates filled every tier, their robes and scales and feathers catching light from the chandeliers that hung like captured moons. Culinary magistrate Zex sat in the position of arbiter, his forearms folded, his compound eyes reflecting the crowd in fractured kaleidoscope. Torvan stood at attention near the eastern pillar, his reptilian face unreadable, though his claws had drummed once against his armor when Christopher entered a gesture that might have been encouragement. Ambassador Valera occupied her throne on the central dais, her posture perfect, her expression carved from ice. Neera sat beside her, markings subdued to near invisibility, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at Christopher as he approached with the dish, but her fingers twitched once, a small movement that spoke volumes. Christopher set the bowl before Valera. The 5-cheese béchamel gleamed under the lights, steam rising in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The pasta lay nested in sauce that held together with impossible perfection, each element distinct, yet unified. Beside the bowl he placed a simple silver spoon, polished until it reflected the ambassador's face back at her. "You have 10 seconds to impress me," Valera said, her voice carrying across the hall. "Or humanity's culinary traditions end tonight." Christopher did not respond. He simply stepped back, hands clasped behind him, and waited. Valera lifted the spoon with the precision of someone performing surgery. She took a small portion, examined it as if searching for flaws in a contract, and brought it to her lips. The hall leaned forward as one organism, breath held, waiting for the dismissal that would cement their superiority. She tasted. Her expression did not change, not immediately. But Christopher saw it, the microscopic widening of her eyes, the way her throat worked as she swallowed, the slight tremor in her hand as she lowered the spoon. Her markings, which had been a controlled violet, flickered once with a color he recognized from Neera, pink, warm, vulnerable. Valera set down the spoon. She stared at the bowl as if it had betrayed her. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than anyone in the hall had ever heard it. "This tastes like my mother's cooking." The hall erupted in confused murmurs. Delegates exchanged glances. Magistrate Zex's antennae twitched forward with interest. Valera's hands, always so steady, began to shake. "Before the Reformation, before we decided that efficiency was superior to tradition, she would spend hours in our kitchen, making dishes that required patience. She said," her voice cracked, "she said that time spent feeding your family was time spent loving them." A tear slipped down her cheek, glowing faintly. She wiped it away with a gesture that looked like anger but was something closer to anguish. "We banned those practices," Valera continued, her composure fracturing with each word. "We called them primitive, wasteful. We taught our children that synthesized nutrients were progress, that emotional attachment to food was weakness." She looked at Christopher, and in her eyes was the weight of generations lost. "What have we become?" Neera reached for her mother's hand. Valera flinched, then held on as if drowning. The hall remained silent, because they had all tasted the same loss, the same efficiency that had hollowed them out, and they had called it evolution. The morning after the judgment, Christopher arrived at the kitchen to find a line stretching from the service entrance to the eastern corridor. Delegates, staff, security officers, even culinary magistrate Zex himself, all waiting in patient silence. Pip stood at the door, his 6-fingered hands ringing together, his bioluminescent markings flickering with nervous confusion. "Chef," Pip whispered when Christopher reached him. They want to eat, all of them. They're requesting earth dishes. They're asking if you can teach them. Christopher looked at the line, at faces from a dozen species, at hands and claws and appendages that had never held wooden spoons or measured love in minutes. He thought of Emma, of his grandmother, of every person who had ever understood that feeding someone was a language older than words. "Let them in," he said. The kitchen transformed over the following weeks. Christopher cooked, yes, but more than that. He taught. Thessian diplomats learned to knead bread, their long fingers perfect for folding dough into layers. Crathari scientists discovered that their forearms made them exceptional at multitasking sources. Grysian officers, whose strength had only ever been used for security, found gentleness in whisking eggs until they became clouds. Nira came every day after her studies, standing on a stool beside Christopher, asking questions that had no end. Why did onions make you cry? Why did salt make things taste more like themselves? Why did some foods need high heat and others needed patience? He answered each question as his grandmother had answered his, with demonstrations, with metaphors, with the understanding that cooking was science and art, and love braided together until you could not separate them. Ambassador Valera came once, standing at the threshold as if crossing it would require admitting something she was not ready to say. She watched Christopher show Nira how to fold cheese into eggs, how to turn breakfast into ceremony. When Nira laughed at the way the mixture bubbled, Valera's markings flared that same vulnerable pink. She turned and left without speaking. But the next morning, she returned. This time she entered. This time she asked if she could watch. The embassy's meals changed. Synthesized nutrients were not banned, but they became secondary, used only when time was truly scarce. The dining hall began to smell like browning butter, like rising bread, like soups that had simmered for hours, until they became something that could not be quantified by nutrition alone. Delegates who had barely spoken to one another found common ground over shared meals. Arguments were still had, but they were had over tables where food reminded everyone that despite their differences, hunger was universal, and so was the need to be cared for. Torvan requested lessons in making stew. Magistrate Zex asked for the recipe for bechamel, then spent 3 days attempting it before admitting he needed guidance. A Velari engineer learned to make pasta from scratch and wept when she tasted it, saying it reminded her of a home she had thought she'd forgotten. The kitchen, once a place of mockery, became the heart of the embassy, not because Christopher had won a challenge, but because he had remembered what the galaxy had worked so hard to forget. That some things cannot be rushed. That patience is its own language. That caring, when translated into food, becomes something everyone can understand. 6 months after the judgment, Christopher sat at a small table in the corner of the kitchen, a blank notebook open before him. Nira sat across from him, her violet eyes watching his hands as he uncapped a pen. The kitchen hummed with the evening shift, Pip managing a station of his own now. Other cooks moving through their tasks, with the confidence of people who had learned that technique without heart was just mechanics. "You're really writing it down?" Nira asked, her markings pulsing with something between excitement and sadness. "I promised I'd teach you everything," Christopher said. "This is part of everything." He began to write, his handwriting steady despite the weight of what he was creating. The recipe for 5 cheese bechamel appeared on the left side of the page, in precise measurements and temperatures. Gruyere from Proxima 7, aged white cheddar from Titan, Comté from the monastery ship, Fontina from Europa Station, Parmigiano Reggiano aged 36 months on Ganymede. Butter, flour, milk, warmed to blood temperature. Instructions that could be followed by anyone with patience and time. But on the right side of the page, he wrote something else. Not measurements, but memories. Not temperatures, but truths. "Start when you have nowhere else to be," he wrote. "This cannot be rushed. Stir as if you are having a conversation with someone you love. Add cheese the way you would offer comfort, in small amounts, waiting for acceptance before offering more. Watch the sauce the way you would watch a child learning to walk, ready to catch but not interfering. Taste not just with your tongue, but with your memory. Does this remind you of being cared for? If not, keep cooking. Nira read over his shoulder, her breath catching. That's not a recipe. That's a letter. It's both, Christopher said. He continued writing, filling the right column with instructions that had nothing to do with cooking and everything to do with living. Remember that food is a language. Speak it with intention. Never apologize for taking time to do something well. The galaxy will tell you to hurry. Don't listen. He wrote about Emma, about his grandmother, about the lineage of care that had brought him to this kitchen at the edge of space. He wrote about the moment Nira had called his food yellow glue and how that honesty had saved him from his own grief. When he finished, he tore the page carefully from the notebook and folded it in half. He placed it in Nira's hands, her fingers closing around it like a treasure. "Keep this," he said, "and when you're old enough, teach someone else. Not just the recipe. The why." Nira's markings glowed soft gold. "I will. I promise." Christopher stood and looked around the kitchen that had become more than a workplace. It had become a place where the galaxy remembered what it meant to be gentle, where time was not wasted but invested, where caring was measured not in efficiency but in the patient accumulation of small, deliberate acts. Outside, stars wheeled in patterns that had no names. Inside, the kitchen stayed warm, and somewhere between the two, humanity had proven that some recipes could change everything.